So we're picking it up in chapter 7, verse 14. When we left off last time, I talked about how one of the accusations is that Jesus is deceiving the people. It's part of the crowd's discussion about him. And this is a place where scholars see what was actually happening in John's own community kind of being injected into the text, because that was a formalized complaint against John's community, that they were, this talking about Jesus was deceiving the people, that it was untrue. So interesting, that kind of bleeds into there. But in verse 14, Jesus had sent his brothers on ahead and saying, I'm not going to go up to the festival of booths. We talked about that. And Jesus kind of wants it on his own terms, I think, because he shows up, he ends up kind of sneaking in, staying undercover. And then just had to get my push notification out of the way there. But Jesus stays undercover and is listening to the crowd. So the question is that Jesus ends up going up and teaching here in verse 14. And does he do that as a response to what people are saying? Did he plan to do that? Who knows? But it's interesting that he had said he wasn't going to go, then he goes, he's hiding, and then he shows up publicly and starts teaching. So verse 14, not until halfway through the feast did Jesus go up to the temple courts and began to teach. So this would have been the most public place of all. So if the Jews are trying to kill him, they haven't really got the power to do that yet, because Jesus perceives that, no, he can still teach openly here. So there he is. Verse 15, the Jews, apparently the leadership, but somehow it gets mixed in with, is John talking about the Jewish crowd or the Jewish leaders? He just uses this term, the Jews. But the Jews were amazed and asked, how did this man get such learning without having studied? So again, as we've seen again and again, there's usually a hard question that leads into a discourse by Jesus, whether he's meeting with somebody like Nicodemus or the woman at the well or Nathaniel or somebody's always asking a harder question. And Jewish leadership does, the crowd does, and here they're saying, how did you get to know this? You haven't even studied. And this is really a question about, I think, the sense of, incarnation. Back to chapter 1, this is the Word made flesh, right? This is God as the Word becoming a human being, and then it's not about what Jesus has learned along the way. If Jesus is the Word, then what he says is who he is. It's not about his learning, right? It's just about who he is as the Word. And I guess the question is, will the people be able to see this, that this teaching, the words that Jesus speaks, are God's teaching, are God's voice? That's the challenge here. So the crowd brings this up, like, where did he get this wisdom? Verse 16, Jesus answered, my teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. So right out of chapter 1, right? The Word was with God, the Word was God, becomes a human being. Verse 17, if anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. And this harkens back to Deuteronomy 18 a little bit, about when Moses talked about the prophet, that, you will be able to discern what he speaks as coming from God or not. So it's a little echo of that. Jesus goes on, verse 18, he who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself. But he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. This is also a familiar way of speaking. When Jesus talked about Nathaniel, he said, here's an Israelite in whom there's nothing false. And here Jesus is talking about being a man of truth, and there is nothing false in him. So there's this kind of a standard of people who hear God, walk with God, understand what God's word is. Jesus is putting this out here a lot like that. Verse 19, has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? So here he must be talking to some of the Jewish leaderships directly and saying, I know what you're trying to do. Me speaking the words I'm speaking under what accusation of the law would you try to kill me? And he says, I know you're trying to kill me. So he's challenging them on the scriptures in terms of his own authority. And and this part of chapter 7 sounds a lot like chapter 5. And this is the place where scholars really look at this and go, chapter 7 doesn't have the same kind of centered gravity that much of John has. It seems to be a little bit broken up, and especially when we get to the next part, it really sounds like this is the conversation that Jesus was having in chapter 5 when he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda, because it was all about him healing on the Sabbath, right? And here in chapter 7, this argument bleeds into this healing on the Sabbath argument pops up again. So when they look at that, they say, hey, this is probably part of what was in chapter 5, and for some reason John separated this out into chapter 7. And there's a few reasons why that's probably what happened, that when material is being put together, the original material seems like this from chapter 7 should have been in chapter 5. So anyway, it's a little bit more, has a little more disjointed feel. But verse 20, well, we'll see that in a little bit. So in verse 20, you are demon possessed, and the crowd answer, who is trying to kill you? So the crowd challenges the idea that the Jewish leadership is trying to kill him. But back in verse 13, if this is really the crowd speaking, we were told that no one would say anything publicly about him because they were afraid of the Jewish leadership. So it's kind of speaking out of two sides of their mouth, but they accuse him of being demon-possessed. And another interesting part about John's gospel as different than the synoptics, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is in John there's no fight with Satan or the devil in John. In fact, Jesus doesn't do any demon exorcism kinds of healing. He doesn't do any of that. In fact, the only place that the word devil shows up, or Satan, is around Judas. That we just heard about that when Jesus says, one of you is a devil in chapter 6, referring to Judas. And then later on at the Last Supper, it says that Satan entered into Judas. But that's the only time we hear about Satan or the devil, and there's no other demons showed up. Now in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they show up all the time. In fact, one of the first things Jesus does is he defeats the devil in the temptation story, and then at least in Mark and Luke, one of the first things he does is exorcise, cast out a demon, and just proving his authority over sort of the demonic realm, or that spiritual realm. John is not concerned with that, and you don't see any of that. So that's also an interesting difference to look at. But here the crowd does accuse him of being demon-possessed. It's another place that this idea shows up, but it mostly comes from others labeling Jesus as demon-possessed. So, verse 21, Jesus said to them, I did one miracle, and you are all astonished. So this reference point in verse 21 is another one of those reasons why maybe this belongs in chapter 5, because the miracle he did there was healing the man at the pool. And then the next miracle came, right, which was feeding the 5,000. So if he says I did one miracle, which one is he talking about? It's not really clear here. Yet you are all astonished. Verse 22, yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses, but from the patriarchs. So that's John explaining that they talk about Moses giving circumcision, which is because of the law, right? Moses writing the Torah. But really, the story is about Abraham being circumcised and starting that whole process. That's just like a little side tangent comment here. But it connects to the Sabbath rules next. So let's see. Still going on verse 22. You circumcise a child on the Sabbath. So that's the point. Jesus is saying, you told me not to work on the Sabbath, which is chapter 5, right? But you circumcise a child on the Sabbath. So Jesus is re-arguing this case about that miracle at the pool. And that's why they think that this belongs back there in chapter 5. Verse 23. Now, if a child can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing the whole man on the Sabbath? So that reference to I did one miracle is now connected here to that pool of Bethesda healing. And so this is more evidence for why this whole part of John chapter 7 should really be in chapter 5, or it has come from there, or somehow they got split up, right? Because what we call source critical understanding of the text, right? That we're looking at how these pieces of the whole story hold together, and what maybe was original material that has now been split up. So he says. He goes back to healing on the Sabbath. Verse 24. Stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. So here Jesus kind of finalizes that whole fight from when he healed at the pool. So maybe the crowds and the leadership was still talking about that miracle, but it really feels like all of this material belongs in chapter 5. So that's, we're halfway through chapter 7. Well, not quite halfway, but more to come, and more of this kind of discourse with the crowd and being challenged by the crowd. So, yeah, we'll just keep on going. Thanks.